The greatest deception Americans face today is not political ideology or economic theory, but the silent accumulation of survival misinformation that will cost lives when genuine emergencies arrive. I have spent 3 decades studying how societies collapse and how individuals navigate catastrophic disruption. From the Great Depression's psychological trauma to Hurricane Katrina's infrastructural failures, and the pattern remains consistent across every crisis. People do not perish from lack of resources but from reliance on false knowledge that shatters under pressure. We consume survival advice through countless channels, scrolling past wilderness hacks on social media platforms, absorbing dramatized scenarios from television productions, repeating oversimplified mantras that promise safety through catchphrases rather than competence. This cultural phenomenon creates dangerous confidence built on foundations of sand, and when the floodwaters rise or the power grids fail or the supply chains fracture, these comforting illusions reveal themselves as lethal substitutes for genuine preparedness. The raccoon pulling back the page in our thumbnail represents this exact moment of revelation, when innocent assumptions give way to harsh realities that demand skills we never developed because we trusted shortcuts over substance. Before we proceed further into examining these 6 catastrophic myths, I need you to understand that this is not entertainment designed for casual consumption but critical knowledge that could determine your family's survival during the disruptions ahead. So stay with me through every example and every explanation until the final word, because compartmentalized understanding will not serve you when systems fail, and you must make decisions with incomplete information under extreme stress. And please take a moment now to comment below, telling me where you are watching from, your city and your country, because understanding our community's geographic distribution helps me tailor future content to the specific regional threats you face. The first myth that kills with regularity is the assumption that compass navigation provides foolproof orientation in wilderness environments. This belief permeates American outdoor culture with such intensity that hikers regularly enter unfamiliar terrain carrying only a compass and smartphone, confident that these tools guarantee their safe return. The reality, documented in search and rescue statistics, tells a different story entirely. Compasses measure magnetic north, not true north, and the angular difference between these 2 reference points, called magnetic declination, varies dramatically across American geography. In parts of Maine, declination exceeds 20 degrees west, while sections of Washington state show 15 degrees east, meaning that a hiker following magnetic north without adjusting for local declination will deviate 1 mile laterally for every 3 miles traveled forward. This mathematical certainty has led countless searchers to focus their efforts miles away from where lost hikers actually wandered, extending rescue times and reducing survival probability as hypothermia, dehydration, and panic compound hourly. The Appalachian wilderness presents additional complications beyond declination errors, as dense forest canopy obscures distant landmarks that would otherwise provide visual confirmation of heading accuracy. Desert environments introduce their own navigational chaos, through heat shimmer that creates false horizon lines and mirages that suggest water sources or structures that do not exist. Mountain regions contain localized magnetic anomalies from iron-rich geological formations that cause compass needles to swing wildly or point toward mineral deposits rather than magnetic poles. These are not theoretical problems extracted from academic papers, but documented causes of fatalities that occur with statistical regularity. Across our national forests and wilderness areas, the deeper issue transcends simple tool limitations and exposes fundamental gaps in how modern Americans understand navigation itself. Our ancestors who pushed westward across this continent did not survive through superior equipment but through developed literacy in reading landscape features, seasonal patterns, water flows, vegetation transitions, and celestial movements. They understood that tools serve navigation knowledge but never replace it, that redundancy matters more than precision, and that humility before nature's complexity keeps people alive while arrogance gets them lost. Contemporary GPS dependency has accelerated this skill erosion to catastrophic levels, creating generations who cannot interpret topographic maps, estimate distances visually, or orient themselves using sun position and time of day. When batteries die or satellites fail or electromagnetic pulses disable electronic systems, these individuals face environments they cannot decode with mental frameworks they never developed. The psychology of compass reliance reveals another dangerous dimension, as people trust the tool's authority so completely that they ignore contradictory evidence from their own observations. Search and rescue professionals regularly encounter lost hikers who walked in circles for hours because their compass indicated a direction that felt wrong, but they overrode their instincts in favor of the instrument's apparent certainty. This pattern mirrors broader American cultural trends toward outsourcing judgment to technology, experts, and institutional authorities rather than cultivating independent decision-making capabilities, grounded in direct observation and accumulated experience. The fire-starting myth reveals similar gaps between popular perception and functional reality. American survival culture fetishizes tools, purchasing ferro rods and magnesium bars and waterproof match cases with the implicit belief that possession equals capability. This consumer approach to preparedness generates substantial revenue for outdoor retailers while producing minimal actual readiness among the purchasing public. The uncomfortable truth documented in wilderness emergency reports is that people regularly fail to start fires even when carrying multiple ignition devices, because fire creation demands far more than sparking combustion. Successful firecraft requires understanding moisture content in various wood species, recognizing how altitude affects oxygen availability and combustion efficiency, selecting appropriate tinder materials based on available resources and weather conditions, constructing fuel gradations that transition from fine tinder through kindling to sustainable burning wood, protecting the developing flame from wind without suffocating it through inadequate airflow, and maintaining psychological composure. While cold-stressed hands struggle with fine motor tasks as core temperature drops and cognitive function degrades, these variables interact in ways that make fire starting profoundly context-dependent. Yet popular survival content presents it as a simple trick achievable through purchasing the correct gadget. The historical record provides instructive contrast to contemporary approaches. American frontier settlers maintained fires rather than repeatedly starting them, understanding that fire preservation demanded less skill and consumed less energy than fire creation. They carried live coals in specialized containers, banked fires overnight with careful ash coverage, and treated flame as precious resource requiring constant attention rather than disposable convenience to be recreated at will. This relationship with fire reflected broader survival philosophy emphasizing efficiency, redundancy, and respect for environmental forces that could support or destroy human life depending on how intelligently people engage them. Modern survival enthusiasts often skip directly to advanced techniques, like bow drills and flint striking, without mastering basic competencies like identifying dry wood in wet environments or constructing proper tinder bundles from natural materials. This inverted learning progression mirrors our culture's preference for impressive demonstrations over unglamorous fundamentals, creating practitioners who can occasionally produce spectacular results under ideal conditions but lack the consistent capability that actual emergencies demand. The difference becomes crucial when you are 3 hours into failed fire-starting attempts as darkness falls and temperature drops and your clothing remains soaked from earlier river crossing, because at that moment you need functional competence rather than theoretical knowledge, practiced muscle memory rather than conceptual understanding, and backup methods when your primary approach fails, as it inevitably will when conditions deteriorate beyond your preparation level. The shelter myth compounds these problems by encouraging people to believe that any overhead cover provides adequate protection from environmental exposure. This dangerous oversimplification ignores the complex physics of heat retention, moisture management, structural integrity, and site selection that distinguish survival shelters from decorative structures. I have reviewed after-action reports from enough hypothermia fatalities to recognize the pattern where victims constructed shelters that appeared adequate but failed to maintain core temperature through the night because they prioritized speed over effectiveness, chose poor locations that funneled cold air or collected water, used insufficient insulation materials, created structures too large to retain body heat, or positioned themselves on ground that conducted warmth away from their bodies faster than they could generate it. The flooded makeshift shelter in our thumbnail illustrates one specific failure mode among dozens that kill regularly across American wilderness areas. Low ground near water sources seems appealing because it provides easy access to drinking water and often features softer soil for construction. But these same depressions become drainage channels during rain events, filling with runoff that soaks bedding, collapses shelters, and creates hypothermia conditions even in moderate temperatures. Effective shelter construction begins not with building techniques but with site evaluation, examining drainage patterns, wind exposure, proximity to hazards like widowmaker branches or unstable slopes, distance from water sources that attract predators and insects, and ground composition that affects insulation and structural stability. These considerations require environmental literacy that comes from experience and observation rather than from watching demonstration videos, because every location presents unique combinations of factors that demand adaptive decision-making, rather than formulaic application of memorized steps. The structural requirements for survival shelters differ fundamentally from recreational camping shelters because survival scenarios typically involve compromised physical condition, inadequate equipment, deteriorating weather, and extended duration beyond the overnight trips that most people prepare for. Your shelter must retain heat efficiently enough to prevent hypothermia, shed precipitation effectively enough to keep you dry, withstand wind loading without collapsing onto you during the night, provide adequate ventilation to prevent carbon monoxide accumulation if you bring fire inside, and accomplish all these functions using materials available at your location, rather than specialized gear you left in your vehicle or never purchased. The next myth: enticing notion that one expertly chosen gadget can replace accumulated skill. Observation, improvisation, and long-term readiness is perhaps the most dangerous misconception circulating in America's preparedness landscape. This belief finds fertile ground in a society saturated with advertising, where knives are marketed as tactical, flashlights as indestructible, and multi-tools as miracle solutions capable of turning any consumer into a frontier survivor overnight. Retailers profit greatly off the American appetite for high-tech gear and disaster kits that claim to guarantee safety with the swipe of a credit card. But the aftermath of recent emergencies, from the grid failures in Texas to the chaotic evacuations during hurricane season in Florida, shows how quickly false confidence can multiply risk. When fires swept Northern California, I examined interviews with survivors who had stockpiled the latest tools but admitted they failed under stress. Batteries died, blades snapped, and complex multi-tools proved impossible to manipulate when adrenaline surged and fine motor skills deteriorated. In post-event analysis forums, even seasoned outdoorsmen documented failures of supposedly rugged knives that corroded after a single river crossing, lighters that malfunctioned in the rain, and so-called military-grade gear that could not withstand prolonged real-world use. The war stories of United States military veterans, reported in books and documentaries, reveal why redundancy and improvisational skill, never mere gadgets, constitute true readiness. Soldiers and rescue workers carry multiple ways to start fire, store water, treat wounds, and signal for help. They rotate through proven gear with a skeptical eye, prepared at every moment for failure and accustomed to compensating for breakage, theft, or abandonment. This culture of contingency has roots in our historic American ethos. The pioneers heading into the Rockies may have prized their steel tools, but they survived because they could improvise cordage from roots, bows from saplings, or clothing from animal hides. Excessive trust in a single do-it-all solution, whether a multi-tool or an expensive filter straw, leads people to neglect the essential mindset of adaptation and practical redundancy that has allowed generations to endure disaster and scarcity. Economic downturns throughout American history illustrate the same principle in the world of money and investments. Those fixated on a single asset class or market, believing one tool protects against all forms of collapse, have repeatedly lost fortunes, while the prudent diversified, adapted, and survived to rebuild. Water myths may be the most persistent survival fantasies in American preparedness circles, and they underscore our collective confusion about what is safe and what is lethal in times of scarcity. Media depictions and viral online posts regularly assure viewers that clear running water is safe, especially after boiling, perpetuating a partial truth that endangers urban and rural populations alike. Field reports from emergency response teams across the United States, whether addressing the aftermath of industrial spills in the Midwest, agricultural runoff contaminating creeks in the South, or wildfire ash polluting reservoirs out west, have documented the tragic consequences of drinking water contaminated with chemical solvents, heavy metals, or slow-dissolving fertilizers. While boiling destroys most living microbes, it does nothing to neutralize synthetic poisons, nitrates, or petroleum products, and it is now common for both urban and rural communities to find their trusted local water sources swiftly rendered hazardous by events originating hundreds of miles upstream. The 2014 Elk River chemical spill in West Virginia and the widespread lead contamination crisis in Flint, Michigan, offer just two haunting examples of disasters where the visual appearance and even taste of water fail to give warning. In drought-prone parts of the West, forced reliance on stagnant pools or receding rivers introduces further dangers. Concentration of parasites like Giardia and Cryptosporidium can be so high that even multiple rounds of boiling fail to eliminate risk. This reality is mirrored in the accounts of Appalachian settlers and frontiersmen who often sought out natural springs carefully shielded from grazing animals and human traffic, recognizing part intuition, part science, that not all water is created equal. The principle emerging here is one of layered filtration, risk assessment, ongoing observation, and multi-step purification, ever the easy solution or single gadget. In modern times, the best practice combines high-quality filters tested against both biological and chemical contaminants, reliable backup chemical purification such as iodine, and boiling as a final safeguard. Field workers in crisis zones use this approach out of necessity, never faith in any one method or manufacture, and the tragic outcomes of neglect are documented every year in the Centers for Disease Control and various after-action analyses from humanitarian response teams. The breakdown of industrial-scale purification in a true crisis, either natural or man-made, will demand that millions of Americans relearn lost arts related to water acquisition, filtration using field-expedient methods from activated charcoal to tightly woven cloth, and constant vigilance regarding the sources they use. Today's rural preppers and off-grid homesteaders, as documented by survival researchers and independent journalists reporting on communities in Montana, Utah, and the Ozarks, tend to rotate between rainwater catchment, spring maintenance, and careful observation of nearby industrial land use. marrying the wisdom of old with a skepticism toward universal promises and gadgets. Mindset myths, perhaps more quietly than the others, have also wormed their way into the American imagination. For decades, media driven by military movies and so-called survival competitions on television have cemented the idea that raw strength or toughness is the single key to making it through any ordeal. Generations have grown up equating survival with the archetype of the lone, muscled hero who conquers adversity using willpower and brawn alone. In reality, as shown conclusively in studies conducted by psychologists in disaster response and confirmed by anecdotal field reports from mass rescue operations to POW survival, the greatest risks are cognitive, panic, tunnel vision, denial, impulsive choices, psychological shutdown. The fatal outcomes of ego-driven decision-making, even among well-trained first responders, are a recurring theme throughout the oral histories recorded after 9/11s, Hurricane Katrina, and the wildfires that devastated communities in the West. These accounts, analyzed by trauma counselors and academic researchers alike, demonstrate that those who outlast the worst scenarios are not necessarily the strongest, but those remaining calm, open to adaptation, and connected to a code or faith that gives them clarity in chaos. The stories told by survivors of the Dust Bowl, Depression-era bank runs, and the collapse of industrial communities in the Rust Belt share a common, often underappreciated thread: flexibility in the face of changing rules, a willingness to abandon failed strategies, and the capacity to reach out to others not only for aid but also for shared problem-solving. Community-based, mutual aid from barn raisings to agricultural cooperatives to urban gardens after economic collapse has been quietly documented in every decade as a bulwark against grief, deprivation, and breakdown. In my research for this documentary, I found that the post-crisis resilience of small towns in the Mississippi Delta owed less to resources and more to the presence of a few calm-thinking individuals, able to inspire order and realistic action in the aftermath of floods and market crashes. Let me pause right here for those of you still with me. If you value deep, reality-based content that pierces through fake hacks and gets you genuinely ready for the unknown, do me a favor, now hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell for future insights, and drop a comment below with your city and country. I want to see just how far this message of truthful preparedness can go and help communities everywhere prepare for what's next. Returning to myth and mind, one must recognize that the self-reliant American spirit, while iconic and empowering, brings with it a shadow, a resistance to learning from others, and a reluctance to admit error in the face of changing facts. It is this overconfidence, found in both Wall Street and wilderness, that has led to some of the costliest mistakes in American history. The Challenger disaster, the great financial crisis of 2008, the doomed expeditions chronicled in works from John Krakauer and Sebastian Jungerol are touchpoints for a national trait. The refusal to let go of old certainties as evidence of failure mounts, yet decades of psychological research into crisis decision-making shows again and again that adaptability, measured self-doubt, and structured improvisation, not blind faith, are the hallmarks of true survivors in any scenario. Adding to the complexity, spiritual and moral frameworks, whether grounded in faith traditions or secular ethics, offer many the clarity to rise above momentary panic and act for the good of the group as well as the self. This is documented across disaster narratives, from the shared prayers and organizational efforts of flood-bound church congregations in Mississippi to the quick-formed secular volunteer groups at Ground Zero in 2001. Now we arrive at the heart of Akeshi Tenkitsu, the collision of myth and consequence. Case histories drawn from FEMA reports, military field manuals, and the vast catalog of post-disaster investigations lay bare the deadly cost of illusory tips. During the catastrophic flooding of New Orleans, many residents stayed believing relief would arrive instantly, misreading decades of civic myth about American disaster logistics. In Houston, neighbors clinging to the promise that city infrastructure would not fail spent days on rooftops, awaiting help delayed by impassable streets and overwhelmed responders, while those who moved fast, trusted gut, and shared resources survived. In national parks, hikers who believed that any creek is safe if you bring a stove to boil have fallen to kidney failure from invisible contaminants, while the unprepared perish of dehydration with clear water all around them. Even after the 2008 financial crash, Americans who had internalized the myth of the stable job, safe real estate, or invulnerable pension found themselves without cash flow, skill sets for barter, or networks for immediate community aid. In summary, the landscape of modern American survival is littered with stories of hubris shattered by crisis. The lessons hidden in each dramatic failure point backward to an older wisdom. The strong survive, but only when strength is yoked to humility, adaptability, and communal spirit. The obsession with gear and gadgets, the over-reliance on single-step solutions, and the deep-seated attachment to comforting but false narratives has exposed our society to avoidable peril. The message threaded through today's real disasters, the documentary archives of the past, and even the whispered warnings of our ancestors, is clear. Preparedness is not a product to be bought, but a lifestyle to be cultivated, day by day, through ongoing learning and unvarnished self. This is what the future will call upon us to remember when the power goes out, when store shelves empty, when government agencies falter, and when faith and practical ingenuity make the difference between those who endure and those who do not.